Every morning, millions of people do the same thing. They wake up, they stumble into the kitchen, and before the day really begins, they make coffee. You probably don't think much about it. It's just coffee. But that innocent-looking cup has a surprisingly complicated past, because coffee was once something that empires tried to control. People smuggled coffee plants across borders. Coffeehouses became places where people argued about politics. Plantations transformed entire countries. Coffee became connected to slavery, revolution, and war, and eventually, it became one of the most ordinary things in an American kitchen. So how did a little plant from Africa become a global obsession? The answer begins with a story that may not even be true. There's an old story about a goat herder named Kaldi. According to the legend, Kaldi noticed something strange. His goats had eaten bright red berries from a particular plant, and suddenly they seemed unusually energetic. Kaldi tried the berries himself, and eventually, according to the story, the secret of coffee began to spread. It's a great story. There's just one problem. We don't actually know that it happened. The Kaldi story appears in much later written accounts, so historians treat it as a legend rather than established fact. What we do know is that the coffee plant has deep roots in Ethiopia, and from there, coffee eventually made its way across the Red Sea to Yemen, and that's where the story becomes much easier to document, because Yemen didn't just drink coffee, it learned how to grow it. By the 15th century, coffee was being cultivated in Yemen, and one port became especially important: Mocha. Coffee leaving the Arabian Peninsula passed through this trading world, and the name of the port eventually became associated with coffee itself. But coffee was valuable, and when something valuable becomes popular, people don't usually want to give away the secret. Yemen had an advantage. It could grow coffee. Other countries wanted the plant itself, so coffee beans could be traded, but getting viable seeds and plants outside the region wasn't nearly as easy. The coffee trade had become a kind of guarded secret, and then Europe came knocking. Coffee didn't just spread through trade, it spread through conversation. By the 16th century, coffeehouses were appearing across parts of the Ottoman world: Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Mecca. And these weren't quiet places where people simply sat with a drink. They were social centers. People talked, played games, listened to stories, shared news, and importantly, they talked about politics. That created a problem for rulers, because there's something governments have always found uncomfortable: a room full of people exchanging ideas. Coffee itself wasn't dangerous, but the conversations happening around it could be, and coffee houses became important enough that authorities sometimes tried to regulate or suppress them. Coffee had accidentally become something more powerful than a beverage. It had become a social network. Eventually, Europeans developed a serious appetite for coffee, but drinking coffee was one thing. Growing it was another, and colonial powers wanted to solve that problem. The Dutch were among the first Europeans to establish large-scale coffee cultivation outside Arabia. Coffee plants reached Java and other parts of the Dutch colonial world. Then France wanted its own supply. And this is where the story starts to sound almost like a spy movie, because a coffee plant isn't just a plant. When the entire world wants to control it, the Dutch had taken coffee overseas. The French wanted their own colonies to grow it. And once coffee escaped Arabia, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. Now comes one of the most famous stories in coffee history. In 1727, Brazil wanted coffee. It had enormous areas of suitable land, a tropical climate, and eventually, the labor system that would make large-scale plantation production possible. But Brazil needed the plant. A Portuguese officer named Francisco de Melo Paleta was sent to French Guiana during a diplomatic mission, and according to the famous account, When he was leaving, the wife of the French governor presented him with a bouquet. But this wasn't just a romantic farewell. Hidden among the flowers were coffee seeds and cuttings. Paleta returned to Brazil, and coffee cultivation began to spread. The romantic details of the story have been debated, but the larger historical outcome isn't really in doubt. Brazil became a coffee powerhouse and eventually the largest coffee producer on Earth. A global coffee industry had just received one of its most important plants. But coffee's expansion came with a terrible cost. Plantation coffee required enormous amounts of labor, and across the colonial world, coffee production became deeply connected to systems of slavery and forced labor. Brazil's coffee economy expanded alongside slavery, which wasn't abolished there until 1888. Other coffee-producing colonies also relied heavily on enslaved labor. The coffee being exported to Europe and America represented wealth. But that wealth wasn't distributed equally. The people doing much of the hardest work often had the least control over the lives they were forced to live. It's easy to look at a coffee bean today and see a harmless little object, but commodities don't tell you their own history. Sometimes you have to look behind the product, behind the plantation, behind the shipping routes, and ask, who actually paid the price for making it cheap? Now coffee crosses another important line. It becomes part of American history. Colonial American coffee houses were places where people gathered to exchange information and discuss politics. And as tensions with Britain grew, coffee became increasingly associated with resistance to British tea. Then came December 1773, the Boston Tea Party. Hundreds of chests of tea were thrown into Boston Harbor. It wasn't simply a story about Americans suddenly deciding that tea was bad. The conflict was about taxation, representation, trade, and British political power. But coffee benefited from the cultural shift. For some colonists, choosing coffee over tea became another way of signaling where they stood. And that tells us something interesting. Coffee wasn't just following history anymore. It was becoming part of it. And then coffee found its way onto the battlefield. During the American Civil War, coffee became an important part of Union soldiers' daily routine. For many soldiers, it wasn't just something they enjoyed. It was part of their ration, part of their morning, part of the routine that made military life feel slightly more normal. When Confederate access to imported coffee was disrupted, shortages became severe. Soldiers experimented with substitutes, but the real thing was difficult to replace. Imagine being exhausted after marching, cold, hungry, and then someone hands you a hot cup of coffee. It doesn't solve the war. It doesn't make you safe. But for a few minutes, it makes you feel human again. And that may be one reason coffee became so deeply embedded in American culture. After the war, Americans didn't stop drinking coffee. Quite the opposite. Coffee became increasingly ordinary. It was in homes, restaurants, hotels, workplaces, railroad dining cars, and eventually almost everywhere. That's when something strange happened. Coffee became so common that people stopped thinking about where it came from. Nobody looked at their morning cup and imagined Yemen or a sailing ship crossing the Atlantic. It was simply coffee, and that may have been the biggest transformation of all. Coffee had gone from a rare and carefully controlled commodity to an everyday habit. By the middle of the 20th century, American coffee had become synonymous with convenience, cheap, mass-produced, familiar. But a new coffee culture was about to appear. In 1971, a small store opened at Seattle's Pike Place Market. It wasn't originally the Starbucks experience we know today. It sold roasted coffee beans. Then Howard Schultz visited Italy, and he noticed something. Italian coffee wasn't simply a drink. The cafe itself was part of the experience. People came to meet, talk, pause, spend time. Schultz believed something similar could work in America. And eventually, the coffee shop changed. Coffee became an experience again, not just something you drank, somewhere you went. And now look at coffee today. There are specialty cafés, independent roasters, single-origin beans, espresso machines that cost more than some cars. You can order coffee that has traveled thousands of miles and have it prepared in less than 5 minutes. That's an incredible transformation. The same plant that was once carefully protected in Yemen is now grown across a huge tropical belt around the world, and coffee has become one of the most familiar rituals on Earth. But underneath the modern coffee shop, the old story is still there. Trade, labor, power, technology, and human curiosity. And that's what makes coffee's history so fascinating. It isn't really a story about coffee. It's a story about what happens when humans discover something they want and then figure out how to produce more of it. A plant associated with the forests of Ethiopia became a crop in Yemen. Yemen became a center of trade. European powers fought to obtain living plants. Coffee crossed oceans. Colonial plantations transformed landscapes. Enslaved people were forced to produce it. Coffee became part of political culture. American soldiers carried it into war. And eventually, it became something you can buy before you even think about it. That's the strange thing about history. The objects sitting quietly in your kitchen can have incredibly complicated stories behind them. So tomorrow morning, when that coffee starts pouring into your cup, you might see it a little differently, because you're not just drinking coffee, you're drinking the final chapter of a story that began thousands of miles away, and somehow it ended up in your kitchen. If you love watching informative videos like this, do me a favor, hit subscribe and share it with a friend who'd find this as interesting as you do. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one.